The Galactic Council was a powerful organization, overseeing countless planets and civilizations scattered across the vast expanse of space. It had been centuries since humanity had begun their journey into the stars, and Earth, now known as Terra, had been quietly watched from afar. The world was rich in resources and potential, yet still very much isolated. Many in the Council considered it an insignificant, undeveloped planet, a curiosity, but nothing worth taking seriously. That was, until they sent the scout fleet. The fleet was dispatched to Terra on a routine mission of exploration. Its purpose was to gather data, assess the planet's resources, and determine whether Terra was ready to join the greater galactic community. The fleet was a small but advanced group of ships, each equipped with the best technology the galaxy had to offer. They were not prepared for what they found. Weeks passed, and the fleet had yet to return any meaningful updates. This wasn't unusual in itself. Exploration missions were sometimes delayed, and data collection often took time. But something felt off. The silence grew heavy, and with every passing day, the uncertainty mounted. Then came the first real signal, a distress call. It was weak and fragmented, but it was enough to get the attention of the Galactic Council. The transmission came from the fleet's lead ship, which had been positioned in high orbit around Terra. The message was hurried, the voice crackling with static. "We've encountered something unexpected. The fleet, we can't." Then silence. The transmission abruptly cut off, leaving the council members staring at their screens in confusion. It was as though the ship had been swallowed by the void, and the crew along with it. The silence that followed was deafening, and the room filled with a mix of disbelief and unease. Commander Vaylor, a respected strategist and veteran of many successful missions, was called in to investigate. He had seen his fair share of strange occurrences in the galaxy, but this was different. The fleet was not just missing. It had vanished without a trace. There were no signs of an attack, no signals of sabotage. It was as though they had simply disappeared. Vaylor sat in front of the Council's main monitor, scrolling through the fleet's final transmissions. Each clip he reviewed seemed to make less sense than the last. The crew had reported normal operations up until their final moments. No signs of hostile forces, no evidence of mechanical failure. Just the sudden, inexplicable silence. As Vaylor read the transcripts, one phrase caught his attention. "It's too late." The words were part of a last communication from the lead ship. The captain had recorded them in a frantic, panicked tone just moments before the transmission cut off. Vaylor leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. What did that mean? He called for a full analysis of the final recordings. The fleet had been far from Terra when they first initiated contact with the planet. They had sent basic scans of its atmosphere and geological composition, all of which seemed perfectly normal. There was nothing that should have caused such a reaction. In his investigation, Vaylor discovered an unsettling pattern. Long before the fleet had arrived at Terra, other scout ships had been sent to monitor the planet, and all of them had met similar fates. Some had vanished entirely. Others had suffered strange malfunctions or had their communications mysteriously jammed. A handful had even sent back warnings, but by the time those messages reached the Council, it was already too late. The oddest part was the lack of any real information on Terra itself. The planet was considered a dark zone in the galactic records. No one knew much about it, and those who had attempted to explore it had returned with fragmented data or nothing at all. The occasional scout mission had confirmed it was a relatively ordinary world, lush, green and teeming with life, but there were no major technological advances, no obvious signs of advanced civilization. Just a primitive world, full of strange but seemingly harmless species. But the more Vaylor dug, the more questions arose. Why had the fleet gone quiet so suddenly? What had caused them to stop transmitting? And why, for all its silence, did Terra seem to have a reputation for causing missions to fail? Vaylor thought back to the initial report he'd read about Terra, the one that had first mentioned the planet's anomalous properties. It seemed like a throwaway comment at the time, but now it felt like a clue. There had to be more to Terra than anyone realized. Something was hidden beneath the surface. He called in his top analysts. Together, they sifted through old files, mission logs, and historical data. The further they went back, the more they discovered strange warnings about Terra. Phrases like, "do not provoke," and "their survival instinct is unmatched," echoed through the records. Even in the oldest data, Vaylor couldn't shake the feeling that the Council had been blind to something important. The reports had always been vague, but they seemed to indicate that Terra was a world of mystery, one that wasn't as primitive as it appeared. But if that were true, why had the previous scout missions failed to get any solid answers? Why had the fleet gone dark? As Vaylor pored over more documents, he stumbled upon an entry from an ancient explorer, someone who had visited Terra centuries ago. The explorer had written, almost prophetically, "The humans are adaptable. They are a species you should never underestimate." The phrase struck Vaylor like a bolt of lightning. Humans, he knew they were a rapidly evolving species, but this statement suggested something far more than simple adaptability. If they had managed to outsmart every mission sent to observe them, they must have developed abilities far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The room grew tense as Vaylor realized something important. The fleet hadn't just failed because of bad luck or technological glitches. They had been outsmarted. But by whom? And how? Vaylor stood up from his seat, his mind racing. He looked out the window at the stars, his thoughts drifting back to the unsettling transmission from the fleet. The captain's final words echoed in his mind. It's too late. What had they seen? What had they discovered that made them fall silent, never to return? He knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, the answers lay on Terra, and he was determined to find them. But the question now was, would he survive long enough to uncover the truth? The Council's next move would be crucial. Whether they sent another fleet, attempted direct communication, or took some other approach, Vaylor knew that Terra had to be explored further. There was no going back. The missing fleet had raised more questions than answers, and the galaxy needed those answers now. Vaylor's investigation into the disappearance of the scout fleet had taken a new turn. He felt like he was staring into a dark abyss, where each step forward only led to more uncertainty. The initial findings had been troubling enough, but as he dug deeper, more layers of mystery began to unfold. Terra, the planet that had been dismissed as insignificant for so long, seemed to hold far more secrets than anyone had ever realized. Commander Vaylor was no stranger to danger or complexity. He had led missions to planets that were far more dangerous than Terra was supposed to be. He'd navigated through hostile environments, worked with alien species that were far more advanced than humans, and even survived situations where the odds were stacked against him. But something about this felt different. It was as though Terra itself was trying to hide something. And every time Vaylor thought he had uncovered a clue, the planet seemed to slip further from his grasp. Vaylor spent hours reviewing old data, going through mission logs that spanned decades. The more he looked, the more uneasy he became. There were records from past Scouts missions that had been sent to Terra before the fleet. At first glance, the reports seemed mundane, almost comical. There were references to primitive human settlements, isolated tribes, and simple technologies. The world was portrayed as nothing more than a blue and green ball floating in space, filled with life but little else. But as Vaylor pored over the documents, something didn't add up. The reports had been vague, inconsistent, and at times downright contradictory. One scout would report seeing primitive structures, while another would mention vast, empty cities. Some logs claimed that humans lived in isolation, while others spoke of complex social structures. And yet, there was one detail that every single report shared. There was always some kind of interference when missions approached the planet. Signals would become scrambled, technology would malfunction. And the further they ventured into Terra's atmosphere, the worse it got. It was as if the planet itself was fighting back. One report from a scout ship nearly 100 years old caught Vaylor's eye. It was dated just after the fleet had made its first attempt to orbit Terra. The transmission was brief and full of static, but the crew had written one line in their log that stood out. "They're watching us." There was no context, no explanation, just a simple phrase that had been dismissed by those who read it as a result of stress or fear. But Vaylor knew better. He had been in situations where fear could cloud judgment, but this didn't feel like a simple case of nervousness. It felt more like a warning. Someone or something on Terra had been aware of the fleet's presence. Even before it arrived, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the desk nervously. A growing suspicion gnawed at him. Could the humans of Terra be more than just primitive? Could they be aware of the galaxy beyond their planet? And if so, how had they kept their knowledge hidden for so long? To find out, Vaylor needed to learn more about the humans themselves. The reports described them as having basic technology, rudimentary tools and weapons, but there were hints scattered across the logs of something much more advanced. One report mentioned a human scientist who had been studying the stars, but his work was quickly dismissed as foolish by the rest of the world. Another log mentioned strange patterns in the way humans communicated, something that resembled the way more advanced species transmitted data. Though the method was far from fully understood, Vaylor couldn't ignore the possibility that humanity had been more connected to the greater universe than anyone realized. The idea that Terra was an isolated, undeveloped planet was beginning to feel like a convenient cover-up. Maybe there was a larger truth to be uncovered. As he continued to dig, Vaylor found that some scouts had actually tried to communicate with humans during their missions. The results were mixed. Some humans seemed utterly uninterested in the ships that hovered above their cities, while others appeared to understand the ship's purpose, but chose to remain silent. One crew member had written in a report that a group of humans had seemed unfazed by the presence of the scout ship, even as it hovered close to their villages. The humans showed no fear, no curiosity, just a quiet acknowledgement, as though they had seen it all before. Vaylor read this over and over, trying to make sense of it. What kind of beings could remain so calm, so unaffected by the arrival of an advanced scout fleet? And if they knew about the fleet, did they know more? His mind wandered back to the captain's last transmission, the one that had been cut off so abruptly. Could the fleet have encountered something they weren't prepared for? Something human? A chill ran down his spine. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that Terra was hiding its true nature, that humanity had been waiting, watching, and perhaps even planning. The idea that a planet could appear so simple and yet be hiding an intelligence capable of understanding spacefaring civilizations was a terrifying one. But that's what Vaylor was beginning to believe. Humans on Terra were more than they appeared. His investigation led him to an old, classified document that had been buried in the deepest sections of the archives. It had been marked with the word restricted. When he accessed it, Vaylor discovered something truly disturbing. There was mention of a Watchers' Council, a group that had been monitoring Terra for centuries, making sure that no outside influences would disturb the development of the human species. The document stated that the human race had been deliberately kept from advanced technology and interstellar contact. But this wasn't because they were incapable of it. The Watchers' Council had determined that humanity was simply too dangerous to be allowed into the larger galactic community. It was a decision made out of caution, a decision that had been upheld for generations. But why? Why had this council been so adamant about keeping humanity hidden away from the stars? And what was it about Terra that made them so certain the planet was off limits? Vaylor read the document carefully. The reasons for isolation were vague, but they seemed to point toward humanity's potential, their capacity for growth and adaptability. There was something in their nature that the Watchers had feared, something that could potentially tip the balance of power in the galaxy if left unchecked. Vaylor couldn't help but think back to the words of the ancient explorer. The humans are adaptable. They are a species you should never underestimate. As he sat there, surrounded by files and reports, Vaylor felt an overwhelming sense of realization. The humans weren't primitive. They had been kept in the dark on purpose. For some reason, the galaxy had decided they were better off left alone. But now, with the disappearance of the scout fleet, that decision was in question. What would happen if humanity was allowed to grow unchecked? What would happen if they were brought into the galaxy's fold? One thing was certain. Vaylor's investigation was far from over. And Terra, once a forgotten world, was now at the center of a mystery that could change the fate of the entire galaxy. The discovery of the old records had already shaken Vaylor's understanding of Terra, but nothing compared to what happened next. Just when he thought the situation couldn't get more confusing, the Council received an alert from one of the outer patrol stations. A drifting escape pod had been detected near the edge of the system. Its design matched the missing scout fleet. For a moment, the entire Council chamber fell silent. Everyone stared at the screen as the pod slowly rotated in space, damaged but still intact. It was the first real clue about what had happened to the fleet. It could provide answers, or it could raise even more questions. But either way, they couldn't ignore it. Vaylor was immediately assigned to the team handling the recovery. The pod was brought aboard a secure medical vessel and rushed to the nearest facility for examination. When the door opened, the atmosphere inside the pod was cold and still, as though time itself had slowed down. There was only one occupant, one survivor from the missing fleet. He looked pale and fragile, barely conscious. His uniform was torn in several places, and strange burn marks covered parts of the interior. The engineers couldn't identify the source of the burns. The patterns didn't match any known weapon or natural phenomenon. But what mattered most was that the survivor was breathing. The medical team worked quickly. They placed him in a stabilization chamber and connected him to life support devices. Hours passed before he finally opened his eyes. When he did, he looked terrified, as though waking from a nightmare that had followed him from space. Vaylor stood by the observation window, watching through the glass. The survivor's expression shifted between confusion and panic as he tried to understand where he was. Slowly, he regained enough strength to speak. The room fell silent when the doctor stepped aside and allowed Vaylor to question him. Everyone waited for the survivor to explain what had happened. Surely he would reveal some clue, some detail about Terra, the fleet's disappearance, or the strange interference. Vaylor approached gently. The survivor's breathing was unsteady, and his eyes were glassy, as if haunted by something he wasn't ready to remember. But finally, after a long pause, he whispered a few words. They saw us before we saw them. The sentence floated in the quiet room like a ghost. Vaylor leaned closer, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Who saw you?" he asked softly. The survivor swallowed hard, his hands twitching slightly. His voice cracked as he repeated, "Humans. They knew we were there. They were already waiting." Vaylor felt a heavy chill run through him. This couldn't be right. How could a primitive species detect a cloaked fleet? How could they prepare for something even the Council considered harmless and routine? The survivor continued in a shaky voice. He described how the fleet approached Terra in the usual formation. Everything seemed normal at first. The ships maintained their standard distance, scanned the surface, and prepared for further analysis. But then something strange happened. All at once, every scanner on every ship registered the same thing, a massive burst of unknown energy coming from the planet. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't even aggressive. It was more like the entire planet had become aware of their presence. The energy felt cold and quiet, almost like it was observing them. Before the crew could react, all cloaking systems on the fleet malfunctioned. The ships were suddenly exposed, visible from orbit. And then, as if the planet had simply decided to reveal itself, Terra's surface lit up with thousands of tiny signals. They weren't weapons. They weren't fighter ships. They weren't anything the fleet had ever seen. But they were definitely not natural. It was as if the planet had eyes watching them from every direction. Survivor struggled to continue. His voice trembled as he tried to piece together the memories. We didn't fire. We didn't engage. We didn't do anything to provoke them. But they already knew everything about us. They knew our positions, our formations, even the layout inside the ships. He paused, breathing heavily. It was like they could read us. Vaylor exchanged uneasy glances with the other officers in the room. This information made no sense. How could humans with supposed primitive technology access something as secure as a fleet's internal systems? The survivor closed his eyes tightly, as if trying to block out the memory. We thought we were watching them, he said weakly. But they were watching us. We weren't the observers. We were the ones being studied. He sounded exhausted, but he continued speaking with a kind of desperate honesty, as though he needed anyone to understand the terror he felt. The moment the fleet realized what was happening, they attempted to retreat. They activated their engines and tried to pull away from Terra's orbit. But then a strange disruption spread through the fleet. It wasn't an attack, but something more like a field and invisible pressure that pushed against the ships. Systems flickered, engines misfired, and navigation screens filled with static. One by one, the ships lost control. The survivor remembered the panic, the alarms, the confusion, the sense of being trapped in a situation no one could understand. We thought they were attacking us, he said, staring at nothing. But they weren't. They didn't need to. Vaylor frowned. Then what happened to the others? Where are the ships? The survivor took a deep breath, and for a moment he held Vaylor's gaze. His eyes were filled with a kind of numb fear. They're gone, he said, almost in a whisper. Not destroyed. Not damaged. Just gone. The room felt colder. Vaylor leaned back, shocked. How could an entire fleet vanish without leaving debris, without sending distress signals, without any trace of what happened? The survivor wasn't done. He described the last thing he saw before losing consciousness. A flash of white light, soft, silent, and strangely calm. It didn't feel like a weapon. It felt more like a reset, a system shutdown, something that simply erased everything in its path. He remembered drifting. He remembered the pod detaching automatically. He remembered nothing after that dot. The medical team signaled to Vaylor that the survivor was reaching his limit. His breathing grew heavy, and sweat gathered on his forehead. It was clear he had said all he could. Vaylor stepped out of the room, his mind spinning. The information was unsettling, confusing, and almost unbelievable. If humanity had such advanced abilities, why did their planet look primitive? Why did their communication methods seem outdated? Why did they appear harmless on the surface? None of it added up. Vaylor returned to the council chamber and presented his findings. Many refused to believe the survivor's story. Some argued he was traumatized. Others suggested his memories were corrupted by stress or malfunction. But Vaylor knew fear when he saw it. The survivor wasn't making anything up. And yet the council was divided. Some wanted to send another fleet larger and more prepared. Others wanted to ban all contact with Terra. And a few suggested waiting to gather more information before taking any action at all. Vaylor remained quiet as they debated. He kept thinking about the survivor's first sentence. They saw us before we saw them. It wasn't just a warning. It was a fact. Terra wasn't an ordinary planet. Humanity wasn't an ordinary species. And the galaxy was far more vulnerable than anyone had realized. Vaylor left the chamber feeling uneasy. There was something deeply wrong about the situation. Something hidden. Something powerful. And whether the council accepted it or not, the truth was clear. Terra had noticed the galaxy first, and the fleet had never stood a chance. After the survivors' interview, Vaylor couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something huge, something that had been hidden for far longer than anyone realized. The information they had gained, though unsettling, was only the beginning. Terra, the seemingly unimportant planet, was starting to feel like the center of a puzzle, and the pieces didn't fit. The more Vaylor thought about it, the more questions he had. The survivor story was unsettling enough. The entire fleet, a collection of some of the best ships in the galaxy, had been shut down without a fight. Not destroyed, not attacked, but shut down. That alone was enough to send a chill through anyone who heard it. If humans on Terra could cause a fleet to lose control without firing a single shot, what else could they do? Vaylor spent the next few days in deep thought, poring over the data the fleet had gathered before their disappearance. The more he analyzed, the more he realized something. The fleet had only scratched the surface of what Terra was capable of. What the humans knew, and perhaps even what they had been preparing for, was beyond anything he could have imagined. The strange thing was, Terra's inhabitants seemed completely unaware of the true danger they posed. At least, that's what everyone assumed. Vaylor wasn't so sure anymore. There had to be a reason for the fleet's complete disappearance, and it wasn't just a matter of bad luck or malfunctioning systems. Something had happened, something that went far deeper than anyone had guessed. The more Vaylor reflected on the data, the more he began to wonder if the humans of Terra were truly as innocent as they appeared. Were they really a species struggling to survive in their own corner of the universe? Or was there something darker at play here? What had they been hiding? More importantly, why? Days later, Vaylor found himself back in the council's chamber, once again facing the high-ranking officers who had heard the survivors' report. The room was tense. The debate had been ongoing for hours, with one faction urging caution and another pushing for immediate action. Vaylor couldn't help but feel that the council was missing something. They were so focused on the fleet's disappearance and the apparent danger Terra posed that they were ignoring a key point. The human race wasn't just surviving. They were adapting, evolving at an astonishing rate. One officer, Commander Jorvan, was arguing that the fleet should be sent back to Terra with a much larger force. He believed that if they struck quickly, the humans could be subjugated before they had a chance to develop further. We cannot allow a species with this kind of potential to remain unchecked, he said firmly, his voice cold and unyielding. Vaylor, who had been silent up until this point, stood up. He could feel his heart beating faster, but his voice remained calm. I disagree, he said, his voice carrying through the room. The humans on Terra are more advanced than we realize. I believe they've been hiding their true capabilities. And if we try to approach them like this, thinking they're some kind of primitive species, we might be making a terrible mistake. There was a moment of silence. Vaylor could feel the eyes of the council on him, some skeptical, others intrigued. He took a deep breath and continued. We've been assuming that Terra is just like any other planet. A simple world with a simple species. But what if we're wrong? What if the humans already know more than we do? What if they've been preparing for us this whole time? Jorvan's face hardened. You're suggesting we sit back and do nothing? That we let them continue to grow unchecked? Vaylor shook his head. I'm not saying we do nothing. I'm saying we need to understand them first. We need to learn more about the humans and their history before we make any rash decisions. The room erupted into a heated debate, each officer offering their own opinions. But Vaylor stood his ground, knowing that his argument was the right one. This wasn't about blind action. It was about finding the truth. Finally, after much back and forth, the council reluctantly agreed to Vaylor's suggestion. They would send a smaller team to Terra, not to engage, but to observe. They would attempt to establish contact with the humans, learn more about their culture, their technologies, and their history. Only then would they decide what to do next. The mission was set. Vaylor's team would be the first to land on Terra since the disaster. It would be a delicate operation, requiring the utmost care and caution. No one knew what to expect, but one thing was certain. Terra was no longer just a backwater planet. It had become the key to understanding a much larger mystery. The team assembled in the days that followed, and Vaylor spent countless hours preparing for the mission. The journey to Terra would take time, and during that time, the team would have to rely on their training and instincts to handle whatever came their way. The task was daunting, but Vaylor believed it was necessary. The journey to Terra was long and uneventful. The ship moved through the dark void of space, the crew working in silence as the planet they were about to land on loomed closer. As they neared Terra's atmosphere, Vaylor couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to step into a world that had been waiting for them. When they finally entered the atmosphere, Vaylor was struck by the sight of the planet. It was beautiful in its simplicity, the sprawling oceans and lush green continents stretching out below them. At first glance, it looked like any other planet. But Vaylor knew better now. Terra was far more than it seemed. The team touched down on a flat plain near one of the smaller human settlements. As the landing gear settled, Vaylor stepped out, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The air smelled fresh, and the sky above was a pale blue, dotted with wispy clouds. Everything seemed normal, almost too normal. But Vaylor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He turned to his team and nodded, signaling for them to move forward. They set out toward the human settlement, their senses alert for any sign of danger. The humans were simple people, at least on the surface. Their clothing was basic, their tools primitive. But there was something about their eyes, something that made Vaylor pause. As the group walked through the settlement, the humans watched them carefully, but there was no fear, no surprise. Just quiet observation. Vaylor couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. These humans weren't acting like they had never seen visitors from space before. They weren't reacting like a species encountering something entirely new. Instead, they seemed prepared, like they knew exactly what to expect. One of the humans stepped forward, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He didn't speak at first, but simply nodded to the group, as if greeting them. Vaylor approached him cautiously, trying to gauge his demeanor. "We come in peace," Vaylor said slowly, trying to make himself understood. The man smiled slightly, his eyes flicking over the team. Then, in a voice that was calm and almost knowing, he spoke. "We've been waiting for you." Vaylor's heart skipped a beat. Those words, "We've been waiting for you." How could they have known? Before he could ask any more questions, the man turned and gestured for the team to follow. Vaylor's instincts screamed that something was wrong, but he had no choice. This was the moment of truth. If the humans were as prepared as they seemed, this could be their only chance to learn the truth about Terra. As they followed the man deeper into the settlement, Vaylor's mind raced. What had they been waiting for? What had they known? And most importantly, what were the humans on Terra capable of? The answers were still out there, hidden beneath the surface of a planet that had, until now, been dismissed as nothing more than a primitive backwater. But now, as Vaylor stepped closer to the heart of the settlement, he realized something important. The humans weren't as innocent as they appeared. They had been preparing for this moment for a long time. The walk through the settlement felt strangely calm, almost too calm. Vaylor expected tension, fear, or at least curiosity from the humans, but instead he saw only quiet confidence. The people watched the team with steady eyes, as if greeting visitors they already knew would come. There was no panic, no confusion, only a kind of silent understanding. The man guiding them moved at an easy pace, his footsteps quiet on the dirt path. Vaylor couldn't help observing every detail around him. On the surface, the settlement looked simple wooden structures, hand-built tools, baskets filled with grain or roots, and children playing with handmade toys. But the simplicity felt intentional, almost like a disguise. What bothered Vaylor most was the feeling he couldn't shake. The humans didn't seem surprised at all. They acted like this meeting had been planned long before the team arrived. And that meant something important, something powerful, was hidden beneath their calm faces. The man led them toward a larger building in the center of the settlement. Its walls were made of stone and wood, but the structure was far sturdier than anything else around it. As they stepped inside, Vaylor felt the air shift, like crossing an invisible barrier. Inside the room, a small group of humans waited. They stood around a long table, their faces focused and serious. One of them, a tall figure who seemed to hold a natural authority, stepped forward with a polite smile. "We knew you would come eventually," the tall human said, his voice steady and calm. Vaylor exchanged a glance with his team. The words were almost identical to what the first man had said. It didn't feel like a greeting. It felt like a practiced statement. Vaylor stepped forward carefully. "You were expecting us?" The tall human nodded. "We've been preparing for this for many years." The room felt even smaller as his words echoed softly. Vaylor tried to hide the unease rising in his chest. "Why?" he asked. "How could you know about us?" The tall human didn't answer right away. He studied Vaylor with thoughtful eyes, as if deciding how much he should reveal. "There is much you don't yet understand about our world," the tall human finally said, "and much we've chosen not to reveal." Vaylor felt tension ripple through his team. Every instinct he had was warning him that the humans knew far more than they should. "We detected your fleet long before it entered our system," the tall human continued, his tone calm but firm. "We watched it for days. We studied your ships, your patterns, your systems, everything." Vaylor's breath caught in his chest. Even the council didn't know how the fleet had been exposed. Their technology was meant to be undetectable to primitive species. But what the survivor had said, it was true. "You knew they were cloaked," Vaylor said slowly. "Yes," the tall human replied without hesitation. "Your ships were hidden from your own kind, but not from us." Vaylor tried to keep his voice steady. "How?" "Your planet shows no signs of advanced technology." A faint smile crossed the tall human's lips. "That's because you've been looking for the wrong kind of advancement." Silence deepened. Vaylor felt the weight of the words sink in. Humans had always been considered behind most galactic species in terms of development. But what if that assumption had been a mistake? What if the humans' real strength lay somewhere else entirely? A tall human gestured to the seats around the table. "Sit. There is much we need to talk about." Vaylor and his team reluctantly took their places. The humans remained standing, watching them with a kind of calm patience that felt both reassuring and unsettling. "As you know," the tall human began, "your fleet disappeared." Vaylor nodded slowly. "We received no explanations. Only a survivor, and he was barely alive." The tall human sighed, not in regret, but in something closer to understanding. "Your fleet did not mean to harm us. We know that. But its arrival triggered systems that have been in place for generations." "What systems?" Vaylor asked, leaning forward slightly. The tall human clasped his hands behind his back. "We protect our world. Not with weapons or armies, but with something far more effective awareness. Vaylor frowned. Awareness? The tall human nodded. Humans on Terra have always had a certain instinct, a sense that tells us when we're being watched. You may call it intuition. You may call it perception. But it is something far deeper. Vaylor felt the air shift again. The room seemed heavier. We sensed your fleet before your ships even reached the outer atmosphere, the tall human continued. We sensed their intent, their shape, their energy. We saw them in ways your technology does not understand. Vaylor struggled to make sense of this. Your planet sensed us. Yes, the tall human said simply. Not because of machines, but because of something much older. Something alive. Vaylor's pulse quickened. Are you telling me Terra itself is aware? The tall human paused, then nodded slowly. In a way, yes. The life on this planet, including us, has been shaped by forces your people have not yet discovered. We don't rely on metal and circuits to detect danger. We rely on something deeper, something you might think of as instinct, but on a scale far greater than one person. Vaylor was speechless. If Terra itself was capable of sensing danger, then the fleet never stood a chance. They had entered a world that was far more alive and far more intelligent than they imagined, the tall human continued. When your fleet came close, the planet reacted. It triggered a kind of reset, not a weapon, not an attack, a protective response. Vaylor felt a chill race down his spine. You mean the light the survivor mentioned? Yes, the tall human said. A harmless pulse that shuts down advanced systems. It was intended to keep us safe, nothing more. Vaylor swallowed hard, but the fleet vanished. The tall human's expression grew serious. Because your ships tried to resist the pulse. They activated emergency measures that caused them to scatter. We didn't harm them. We simply stopped them. Vaylor tried to process everything. The Council had assumed the humans might be hiding technology, but this was far more complex. Terra didn't use machines. They used something natural, something fundamental, something powerful. What about the survivor? Vaylor asked quietly. Did you save him? The tall human nodded gently. Yes. The moment we found his pod drifting in our upper atmosphere, we helped stabilize it. We didn't want anyone harmed. Vaylor exhaled, a small sense of relief washing through him. At least the humans weren't hostile. They were protecting themselves. But then the tall human leaned forward slightly. His voice dropped to a calm, steady tone that made the room feel even smaller. You must understand something important, he said. We did not reveal everything we know, not to the fleet, not to your council, and not to you. Vaylor felt his chest tighten. Why? Because the galaxy is not ready for us yet, the tall human replied. But more importantly, and I say this with no hostility, your people are not ready for us. His words landed heavily. We know you fear potential, the tall human continued. You fear what you cannot control. And humans cannot be controlled. Not by any council, not by any other world. Vaylor felt the truth in his words, sharp and undeniable. We have watched your galaxy for a long time, the tall human said. Long before your fleets watched us. Vaylor looked up sharply. You've watched us? Yes, the tall human replied calmly. We are not as isolated as you think. We have seen your wars, your alliances, your mistakes. And we learned from them. Vaylor could feel his pulse racing. The humans had been watching the galaxy in secret. Not with machines, but with awareness, with instinct, with something that technology couldn't measure. What do you want from us? Vaylor asked quietly. The tall human's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. Peace, he said, and understanding. But make no mistake, we will protect our world. We will not allow ourselves to be controlled or judged. Vaylor nodded slowly, feeling both humbled and unsettled. The tall human continued. Tell your council this. Terra is open to communication, but not to domination. If they approach us with respect, we will answer. If they approach with fear or aggression, the planet will respond. Vaylor understood then what made humans so dangerous and so extraordinary. They weren't the strongest species. They weren't the most advanced, but they were aware. They were connected, and they were impossible to deceive. Terra had been preparing for this moment for generations. And now, the galaxy would have to decide how to deal with humanity, a species more powerful in silence than others were in war. Vaylor stepped out of the meeting hall, feeling as if the ground beneath him had shifted. The sky above the settlement was calm, soft light spilling across the horizon, but his thoughts were anything but calm. His team walked behind him in silence, each one trying to make sense of what they had just learned. Humans were far different than anything the Council had imagined. They were not primitive. They were not unaware. They were not weak. Instead, they were something else entirely quiet, observant, and deeply connected to their world in a way no other species Vaylor knew could match. The guide from earlier waited near the doorway, watching them with that same quiet confidence. He gestured for them to follow once more, and Vaylor forced his mind to focus and keep moving dot as they walked back through the settlement. The people continued their daily tasks, almost as if nothing unusual was happening. A group of children played near a small river, tossing stones into the water and laughing at how far they skipped. A few older villagers worked together, repairing a wooden structure. All of them noticed the alien team passing by, but none reacted with fear or excitement. They simply accepted their presence, as though visitors from the stars were just another part of life. It was this calm acceptance that made Vaylor uneasy. Every other world he had visited reacted with shock, curiosity, or pride when meeting off-world travelers. Terra acted like it had seen far more than what the galaxy believed. One of Vaylor's team members quietly whispered, "They're not afraid of us at all." "No," Vaylor replied in a low voice, "because they don't need to be." They continued until they reached the edge of the settlement, where the forest spread out behind them like a wall of green. Their transport pod was parked just beyond the trees. The guide stopped and turned toward Vaylor with a thoughtful expression. "You have much to tell your council," he said softly. Vaylor nodded. "More than they want to hear." The guide smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but the truth doesn't change just because someone refuses to accept it." Vaylor looked at the forest, thinking about how the humans described their world. A planet that could sense danger. A species that could feel the presence of things long before they arrived. And a society that hid its true abilities, not out of fear, but out of patience. He turned back toward the guide. "Will you allow us to return? In peace?" The guide gave a slow, steady nod. "If you come with open minds, yes. Terra welcomes those who respect it." Vaylor felt a strange mix of relief and worry. The humans were willing to talk. But how would the council react when they learned what Terra truly was? "We will speak truthfully," Vaylor said, "no matter how they respond." The guide stepped back, giving them space. "Then we will meet again." The walk to the pod felt heavier than the walk to the settlement. The forest seemed almost alive, every leaf and every gust of wind carrying a strange awareness. Vaylor had always trusted technology over instincts, but now he wasn't sure which one mattered more. As the pod's door opened and the team stepped inside, Vaylor took one last look at the forest. It was quiet, still, and peaceful. But beneath that peace was something vast, something watching, listening, and waiting. Once inside, the pod lifted smoothly off the ground. The settlement shrank below them as the trees grew smaller and smaller. The humans, now tiny figures, simply watched them go with calm expressions. No fear, no anger, no hesitation. Vaylor couldn't help feeling as though Terra was watching, too, not just the people, but the planet itself. As the pod broke through the clouds and re-entered the silent black of space, Vaylor finally exhaled. "We need to prepare the report." One of his team members muttered, "The Council will call it impossible." "They will," Vaylor agreed. "But they will still have to hear it." The pod docked with their orbiting ship, and soon the report began. It took hours. Every detail had to be described carefully. The missing fleet, the survivor's account, the human's strange perception, the planet's instinctive defenses, and the calm way humans explained it all. By the time they were done, the ship was silent. Everyone knew the Council would not be happy. When the message was sent, all they could do was wait. Hours later, a response arrived. The Council demanded an immediate return. They wanted answers. They wanted proof. And above all, they wanted control. Vaylor knew then that they did not understand anything yet. As the ship began its long journey home, he found himself looking out the window at the shrinking blue planet. Something deep inside him felt a quiet respect for Terra, something he had never felt for any world before. Once the ship arrived at the Council station, things unfolded fast. They were taken into a large briefing room where high-ranking officials waited with stern expressions. The questioning began immediately. How can a primitive world detect a cloaked fleet? One council member demanded. "Because they are not primitive," Vaylor replied calmly. "How can a planet emit a pulse strong enough to disable advanced ships?" Another asked. "Because it is alive in a way we do not understand," Vaylor said. "How can humans know things we cannot?" A third asked sharply. Vaylor hesitated, then answered truthfully. "Because they are aware of things we have forgotten how to sense." The room murmured in disbelief. Some officials whispered, others scowled. One raised his voice. "Are you suggesting this species is more advanced than us?" Vaylor shook his head slowly. "Not more advanced, more complete." Silence fell. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, one leaned forward. "Do they pose a threat?" Vaylor remembered the calm settlement, the peaceful people, the quiet strength in their voices. "No," he said, "not unless we try to control them." The council didn't like that answer. Not one bit. Discussions turned heated. Some argued that humans were a potential danger. Others believed they should be left alone. A few wanted to send another fleet, something Vaylor strongly warned against. "If you send ships with fear or aggression in your hearts," he said firmly, "Terra will respond, and you will lose." The council didn't respond to that. Not right away. After hours of debate, Vaylor and his team were dismissed. They waited outside in the quiet hallway, tension thick in the air. Finally, the council summoned them again. The room was quieter this time. The decision had been made. "We will open peaceful communication with Terra," the council leader said. "We will not send ships with weapons. We will not demand control. We will simply observe and learn." Vaylor felt relief wash through him like a cool wave. That is the correct choice. But then the leader added, "We will also prepare in case things change." Vaylor's relief dimmed, but he didn't argue. At least the council wasn't choosing war. Days later, a small delegation ship was assigned for the first official diplomatic mission to Terra. Vaylor was chosen to lead it, something he didn't expect but accepted with calm understanding. As the new ship traveled back toward the blue world, Vaylor felt different from before. He was not afraid. He was not uncertain. Instead, he felt a quiet respect and a strange sense of familiarity. When the ship entered Terra's orbit, there was no pulse of light, no defensive reaction. It seemed the planet recognized them, or perhaps recognized their intention. The ship landed gently near the same settlement. The same quiet guide stood waiting, as if he already knew the exact moment they would arrive. "You came back," the guide said with a calm smile. "Yes," Vaylor replied, "and this time we hope to learn." The guide nodded. "Terra welcomes those who seek understanding." As Vaylor stepped forward, he felt something he had never felt before on any world, a sense of belonging, as if Terra was more than a planet, as if it was a living presence that accepted those who approached with open hearts. And in that moment, Vaylor truly understood. The humans had not been hiding because they were afraid. They had been hiding because they were preparing for this moment, for the day the galaxy would discover the truth about them. And now, that moment had finally come.